Let me start this video by asking you a question. Do you prefer open world or linear games? Now, depending on the type of games you play, the answer to the question might be a little bit different. I don't know about you guys, but ever since the whole pandemic started, I've been playing a ton of video games. I used to be a multiplayer kind of guy, but I've recently been experimenting with single player games. A couple weeks ago, I made a video going over easy mode in video games. Check it out if you haven't already, links in the description. And one thing I mentioned is that difficulty can certainly vary if the game is open world or linear. So that got me thinking, if that's the case, then which one is better? What are some of the pros and cons? And which one do I personally prefer? So before we even get started, make sure you hit the subscribe button. We hit my 300 sub goal, and so we can only go up from here. Also, if you're already subscribed, why not just hit the bell so you can be updated whenever I post a video? Anyways, guys, like always, my name is Kwesi, and this is Just a Game. So before we even dive deep into this video, I think the best thing to do is to give my definition of what linear and open world games are. So let's start with open world. So the idea of an open world is that everything you encounter, such as NPCs, items, and side quests, are scattered all across the world, and it's up to you to discover them. Typically, they won't tell you where these things are, and the idea is that if you explore hard enough, you'll stumble across everything. The concept of choice is really important in these games. Typically, open world games might feature dialogue wheels where certain things you say to NPCs might affect the story in the long run. Of course, these elements aren't exclusive to open world games, but they're really popular among them. Linear games function a little differently, whereas open world games put everything in front of you. Linear games tend to give you things piece by piece. Think of the linear experience as reading a book. You watch as events play out. The downside is predictability. Not to say that all linear games are predictable, but if you pay attention to certain events, you can kind of guess what's going to happen next. In my opinion, linear games are more relaxed. You're not pressured to do every single thing the game has to offer. I say this because sometimes as you play open world games, there might be time sensitive events where if you miss it, you can never come back to it. So sometimes you'll feel pressure to do everything in a certain section before you move on in the game. You don't really have that problem with linear games. Typically, if you finish the game from start to finish, you probably would have experienced everything the game had to offer. So when it comes to storytelling and gameplay, how do the two differ? Well, when it comes down to it, I prefer linear storytelling. Personally, I hate missing out, and sometimes open world games tend to have time-sensitive events where if you're not completed in a certain point of time, you'll completely miss it. Right now, I'm playing Final Fantasy X-2, review coming out soon, and apparently there's 3 secret endings, and to get all of them, you have to achieve a certain completion percentage. Here's the problem. To complete everything in the game, you have to do all the side quests, and the worst part about it is that many of them can be completely missed. This means that if you miss one side quest, you have to restart the entire game from the start just to get all the endings. Now, I will admit, for most open world games, this isn't common, but whenever it does come up, it can be a little bit annoying. Now, linear games tend to have a straightforward style of gameplay. Usually, if you play the game from start to finish, you're probably going to experience everything the game has to offer. Although this can be very convenient, it can sometimes strip the game of any depth or meaning. On the other hand, with open world games, they can really expand on their lore. Open world games do not heavily depend on character dialogue, and sometimes you can even find story elements scattered across the world. So when it comes down to the two genres, I honestly believe that open world games have more to offer when it comes to content. Typically when you play open world games, you can expect a ton of side quests and activity, even though as I mentioned earlier, it can be annoying if you have to do these quests in a certain amount of time. But when you're not restricted, it can actually be pretty cool. My favorite type of side quests are the ones that introduce us to different perspectives of characters. Ghost of Tsushima does a great job with the side quests. Most of these side quests, you learn about the different samurai around Tsushima and what they've been up to since the Mongol invasion. At first glance, these side quests feel like a block in the game and almost like a chore, but as I kept playing some of these, I found the character interactions to be pretty cool. What's even more cool is that most of these stories are optional. So if you wanted to, you could just play the game normally and ignore all these quests. Of course, some events might happen differently, but you still get the same ending. So to sum it up, open world games are typically more out there with their storytelling. You can find bits and pieces of the story scattered across the world, where linear games typically give you everything piece by piece. The game basically controls when and how something happens. Now, if you ask me the question what type of storytelling I prefer, I'd probably say open world if done right. I already talked about Final Fantasy X-2 and the idea where a side quest is time sensitive, but if you're given the freedom to tackle quests whenever you want, I feel like that is the most optimal way of playing. But of course, this is nothing but just my opinion, so go ahead and let me know what you think in the comments. Now, so far we discussed the main differences between open world and linear games. Personally, like I mentioned earlier, I tend to fall into the open world camp, but this video isn't really about me. What is your favorite type of game? Open world or linear? Now, I want to make the assumption that the answer might depend on the person I'm asking. I think people like myself who enjoy open world game tend to have a little bit of extra time on our hands. Now, it's no surprise that given the size of these games, they're gonna take a while to complete. Now, I'm in my final year of college, so I don't have a lot of time, so whenever I start an open world game, I have to commit to it. I usually just exclusively play that game until I beat it, or else I'll get distracted and never come back. Also, I feel as if these games bring out my inner completionist because I almost feel challenged to do everything the game has to offer. Now, if you're a fan of linear games, you probably like convenience. You probably solely play these games because you don't have a lot of time on your hands and you don't want to play one game for months. Now, don't get me wrong, just because linear games are convenient doesn't mean they lack quality. I think linear games tell some of the best stories and have some of the best gameplay. And this goes to more of a technical aspect, but I also think with open world games, because the games are so big, more of the console's performance goes to generating the world. While linear games typically have less, so there's more emphasis on the graphics and aesthetic. But of course, this might vary from person to person. And the last thing I want to squeeze into this video is that not every game is going to be 100% linear or 100% open. So I want to go back to what I said earlier. I mentioned Final Fantasy X-2 in the open world section. Now, I know someone out there is probably like, hey, that's not an open world game, and you're right. I think when it comes down to Final Fantasy and games like it, it's a combination of both open and linear. Final Fantasy does have linear sections. Heck, most of the map in X-2 is just long hallways where you go from point A to point B. So yes, the gameplay is linear, but there are open world aspects. You have the freedom to customize your party, you have to make certain decisions when it comes to character interactions, and there is a little bit of exploring when it comes to treasure chests and maybe fighting enemies. So Final Fantasy X-2 is really just a mixture of both. And I think when you mix these two genres together, you can get some really good games. Games like Kingdom Hearts, Nier Automata, and the Tales series are a few games that have a mixture of open world and linear that are pretty good in my opinion. But I think I'll stop the video here and ask you guys a simple question. What do you prefer and why? I feel like I've been asking that question all video, but I personally like the discussion, and I'll definitely be in the comment section talking to you guys. Also, end of the video, I'm gonna say it again. We just hit 300 subscribers, and we're getting closer and closer to 1,000, so it'll help a lot if you hit the subscribe button. And also, if you enjoyed the video, make sure you leave a like. My name is Quasi, and this was just a game.